Good day to you all, wherever you happen to be. I am Eva Yulutilli. I'm co-chair of Chapter Zero Mexico and a member of the governing board of the CGI. On behalf of the NACD US Climate Initiative of the National Association of Corporate Directors, Chapter Zero Canada and Chapter Zero Mexico, organizer of this session of this CGI Global Summit, I hereby welcome you to hear the views from non-executive directors of companies based in North America on the challenges implied in incorporating supply chains in their boardroom climate strategy. Please be reminded that this session will be recorded. The views of the speakers only represent their personal views and may not be attributable to any particular organization. And to encourage you to ask questions using the Q&A function of Zoom, and wish that all of you enjoy this before the last session of the CGI Global Summit. I leave you with my admired and esteemed friend Duncan Wood, Vice President for Strategy and New Initiatives of the Wilson Center, one of the foremost renowned specialists on North America, who will be moderating this panel. Duncan, up to you.
Thank you so much, Eve, and good afternoon to everybody, or good morning if you happen to be in that time zone at this point in time. It's a great pleasure to be here to be talking about the link between climate change, supply chains, and your boardroom climate strategy. I'm delighted to have with us today three excellent panelists who will provide diverse points of view on this key question. Let me begin by introducing Anne Sheehan, Director of Victoria's Secret & Company and former chair of Investor Advisory Committee at the SEC. Secondly, Jessica McDonald, the GFL for Environmental at Kerr Mining Incorporated. And finally, last but not least, Luis Miguel Villatella, who is the Director of Grupo Financiero HSBC Mexico, Aliatica, which is great to have folks from all three North American countries here today. So welcome to you all. I'm looking forward to a very dynamic and informed discussion today. Let me begin by sort of setting the scene a little bit. For the past 2 years here in Washington, we've seen a very intense focus on the question of supply chains, largely oriented towards the questions of national security, geopolitics, but also, of course, towards questions of climate change, in particular under the Biden administration. We've seen some major achievements in that regard, particularly this year. We have had, of course, the Bipartisan Infrastructure Act. We've had the Chips and Science Act, dedicating huge amounts of money to research and design. We had, of course, the Inflation Reduction Act. All of these new initiatives, legislative initiatives that have come through and have actually passed through the US Congress are leaving an enormous impact on supply chain thinking in companies. But beyond that, of course, we're seeing a process which dates back, shall we say, 60 years of a gradual evolution of thinking within companies over how they actually structure their supply chains. And the work that we've been conducting at the Wilson Center here in Washington has focused on understanding supply chains for critical minerals, for semiconductors, for electric vehicles, and we're going to be looking in the future at the energy supply chain as well. And what we've seen here is an evolution in the thinking about supply chains, something that I like to call the move from value to values. So initially focusing on the sort of the era of unfettered globalization, where companies aimed to produce where it made most economic sense to do so. In other words, with a focus on value for money. And value for money is not just the cost, but also, of course, the time it takes to produce things, and of course, questions of quality. But we've seen over the past several decades a gradual evolution alongside increasing globalization, where we've seen an increasing concern over values. And those values, of course, are to do with security, national security, security of supply, but also, of course, to questions of ESG, environment, social, and governance questions. And within the E of ESG, but also very clearly within the S and the G, climate features very, very heavily. And so recently we have seen major decisions being made by large investors to focus more heavily on ESG investing. We've seen the moves recently reported by European insurers such as Munich Re to diversify their portfolios entirely away from oil and gas and fossil fuel projects. The move by Munich Re on October 6th was really ground shaking or earth shaking in my opinion, because they've made a commitment after April of next year that they will not be involved in insuring fossil fuel projects. And that follows on from moves by Allianz and Lloyd's and many other major insurers. So what we're seeing here is an evolution of thinking, partly because of questions of public relations, partly because of questions of making sure that shareholders are happy, often to do with increasing concerns from investors and insurers. And so what we're seeing is this evolution of supply chain thinking. And of course, all of this has been brought home by what happened with COVID, what's happened with the Russian invasion of Ukraine, and of course, the fears over what is going to happen, of course, in the event of a Chinese aggression against Taiwan. So having provided that very general overview of where we are in supply chains thinking, I'd like to launch straight into the conversation. And I'm going to begin with you, Jessica, on the question of geopolitical trends in supply chains. And how do you see that impacting organization strategy and risk assessment? And then I'm going to go to Anne and Luis afterwards. Jessica, go ahead.
Sure. Thanks, Duncan. And it's such a great pleasure to be here. Fantastic panel along with my colleagues. That was a great lead-in on the geopolitical question. And for sure, there's a very significant impact in terms of supply chains and company strategy. The pandemic and its impacts are so much on our minds currently, but there are these macro geopolitical trends that have pre-existed the pandemic and now, pardon me, take on even more focus today. Excuse me. I wanted to take an example from a Canadian perspective, particularly a Western Canada perspective that applies to the whole nation. And really, this is Canada's effort to diversify trade. I mean, that's not unique to Canada, but our very close and valued friends here in North America, make up almost all of Canada's exports. 75% of Canada's exports go to the United States, and half of all imports come from the United States. So that doesn't leave a very great remainder in terms of diversified trade with other countries. And certainly opening up ties to the Asia Pacific in particular have been a focus and will continue to be a focus for Canada. There's no question. But there's completely different risks today in addition to the diversification and globalization and taking minerals and metals as just a very specific example that I find very interesting. The security of supply, and in particular of critical minerals, lithium, nickel, copper, for example, silver also, that are needed for our transition to a sustainable economy, and whether or not adequate supply can actually be secured on our own continent. And so focuses have dramatically shifted. And rare earth minerals are another, even more sort of specific example of all of this. So companies have over the past number of years, particularly I think in tech companies, but not exclusively, there have been standalone responsible sourcing policies. Oftentimes you hear these called ethical sourcing or ethical purchasing. I mean, there's all kinds of different names that all mean sort of the same thing, which talk about labor, human rights, the environment, all very, very important issues. And I would add too, from a Canadian perspective, Indigenous rights issues. But now, again, speaking very specifically about supply chains, you see the adoption of more specific sort of OECD guidelines on the purchasing of metals and minerals as component parts that are needed for production here in North America. And this gets very interesting and much more specific in terms of the ESG focus on the minerals and metals, and that forces North American suppliers, where there is perhaps greater security than other parts of the world, to be thinking even more about those ESG factors than may have previously been adopted in what you referred to, Duncan, as the evolution as we've moved forward on all of this. And which takes us to a final point that I'll make, which is even further developments. We now have, for example, a few years old, the Royal Canadian Mint, pioneering along with partners, vault chain gold, which is taking blockchain technology and creating a ledger so that you can transparently have verified gold in trades between producers and purchasers in terms of geography, as well as the ESG production standards of the product. And so I think it's just interesting from a mining and metals perspective, just to wrap up, how our supply chain interests have really been influenced by these macro geopolitical trends, become even in more sharper focus, security of supply on our continent being a tremendous area of focus. But then also ensuring that the ESG aspects of production are verifiable and transparent. And this is being driven not just by reporting requirements and investors, but also by the purchasers in the supply chain of all of this. So, a few thoughts there in terms of the geopolitical influences.
Thanks so much, Jessica. That's a great way to get us started. I'm going to turn to you, Anne. So please feel free to comment on that first question, but I'd also like to sort of move us on immediately afterwards to the question of emissions reporting requirements and how you see that intersecting with the challenges of having a reliable supply chain. At the core of all of this, whether we're talking about geopolitics or ESG concerns, climate specifically, companies have to actually square the circle. It's all well and good to say that we're going to focus on values, but we have to provide the value as well. Otherwise, we're simply not competitive. So how do you actually bring those two things together? As I say, feel free to comment on the geopolitical question as well, but I'd really be interested in hearing your views on the emissions reporting requirements and a reliable supply chain.
Yeah, so thank you. Thanks for the question and thanks for the opportunity to present. So let me touch a little bit on the geopolitical and then get to your question in terms of that, because obviously any board member who is sitting on a board that has to, and I'm on a retail board, looks at the supply chain. We have production in a number of countries, so we have to look at the geopolitical issues. I think the pandemic really brought home the risk to the supply chain that can be presented if it's not well managed. I think the Russia situation really created geopolitical issues for many companies, for many, not necessarily for ours, but for many in terms of supply chain production issues, but also just the geopolitical risk of operating in that country after what happened. And then I think the last couple of years, because of the pressure on supply chains, has really forced companies to look at where these things are coming from. And then also to sort of get to the climate issue, what are the ways that you're transporting potential supplies for your products into the country, whether it be through ship or air or whatever, and then figuring out sort of the climate impact of that. So I do think the whole issue of responsible sourcing, as you look at the materials that you are then sourcing to make your products, as Jessica talked about, and then making sure the suppliers have a responsible contractor type of policy in terms of the people they're employing. So the whole ESG gambit is really hit on this whole supply chain issue in terms of human rights as well as others. So definitely the ES and G, as you say, of ESG. And for a retail company, this is very real in terms of the products that are being made. I think in terms of the emissions, you know, many of these would be scope 3 in terms of not, you know, they don't belong to the company, but beginning to query the suppliers about what are the emissions that are coming from either the transportation, the manufacturing, the production. What are the requirements in the geographic region that you're in? And how transparent is the company in terms of trying to provide information to stakeholders, including investors, employees, making sure that reducing the environmental impact of these operations on our various stakeholders. And as you say, the values that they have in terms of making things that that are reducing, not just not having a negative impact on the environment, but perhaps reducing that negative impact and what can be done. Certainly in the retail sector, you look at the circularity of the product in terms of how can we make things that are more environmentally sensitive. If it goes into the waste stream, what can be done to reduce that? So I think from the emissions reporting, it definitely intersects in terms of the supply chain and how all of us will be reporting that as the regulations come forward from each of the rulemaking bodies. I think in terms of the various sectors, you know, retail is very different than mining and industrial or others. So I think it will just depend on the specificity of the industry as to how they look at the responsibility and on the reporting. Some of us will look at our own operations, some will look at our supply chain operations, but it'll just depend on the industry that you're in. And the board needs to educate itself on these various issues of what are the implications for their company and the role that the board plays to make sure that these requirements are being met.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you, Anne. That's a great contribution to understanding. And I'm going to come back to each of you later on to ask about recommendations that you would have for boards as they evaluate the supply chain and its relationship to climate strategy. But I want to turn to Luis. Luis, you know, feel free to comment on the geopolitical aspect here. Obviously, emissions reporting requirements, as Anne has just addressed. And, you know, I'm looking to you, obviously, for a perspective that comes from, you know, the world of finance and how you see this playing out in the sort of in the broader economy and in the availability of finance for companies as they reevaluate their supply chains.
Thank you, Duncan. Thank you very much for the opportunity to talk today. Just very quickly on just going back to the geopolitical one, I know it's been addressed by my colleagues. I would just mention that Mexico has been no exception with the negative effects of the Russia-Ukraine conflict, the China-Taiwan conflict, the pandemic, etc., etc. We have had obviously industries like energy, fuels, commodities, and the food sector that have been affected, you know, with price increases, delivery delays, fluctuation of FX, etc., creating a lot of uncertainty. And my only point on that one related to strategy and risk assessment is that this just basically proves and confirms that the strategy and the risk assessment needs to be constantly revised and updated. Okay. In the case of the new requirements for basically scope 3 emissions, you know, the only thing I would probably add is that in countries like Mexico, for example, you know, these are completely new for small and medium enterprises. As you know, we don't have any local regulation. So this basically, all these requirements come from the European taxonomy, companies that have basically European capital, European businesses, etc. So, but we do not have a local regulation in this matter. So basically, these are my only comment would be that you know, there are a lot of small and medium enterprises who, in many cases, ignore the basics of even climate change, and the methodology to calculate, you know, CO2 inventories, carbon inventories, and the different decarbonization strategies, et cetera, and ways to reduce them. So basically, I think, Scope 3 emissions need a comprehensive information and training campaign, which will probably resulting in an extensive environmental commitment from suppliers. No, basically, that's what I think. What we need is to get the commitment from suppliers to basically learn about it and commit to do what it takes to be able to meet the regulation. And this is going to require a lot of human capital and a strong economic effort, I think. In my view, the financial sector is the one who's got the greatest challenge, as you mentioned, because with respect to Scope 3, as you know, there is this investment category 15, which is quite complicated to measure. Basically, this will be my comments regarding the emissions reporting and the geopolitical trends and matters. In the case of how boards should be, evaluating or incorporating supply chains into their climate strategy, I would, as they look to minimize Scope 3 emissions, I would probably say the first step is probably to have a robust inventory of the Scope 1 and Scope 2 emissions. And then subsequently, in order to have our Scope 3 emissions, in the value chain, they should also measure their own Scope 1 and Scope 2 emissions. And once the areas of opportunities in our chain have been identified, then probably there must be an approach with these areas to basically raise awareness regarding the correct measurement of emissions, their importance, and the need for collaboration. The main idea is basically to make clear to them that these are very important, and that together the company and the supply chain can propose and define objectives, initiatives, and strategies to reduce emission. I mean, what I'm trying to say is that this is a collaborative effort, and basically, I think the company should look for allies, within the suppliers, clients, company staff, whoever, so that, realistic targets can be properly defined and prioritized, and then, have even the suppliers prioritize according to their commitment. Remember that Scope 3 not only includes transport suppliers, which is normally what is mentioned in the analysis, but it also includes, as you mentioned, raw material production, treatment of residuals, et cetera, no? But my main point, just to finish the point, is that collaboration is key. One advice could be to generate like a roadmap of all supportive suppliers, and basically build a strategy in collaboration with them to generate all the information we need to properly calculate the inventories. No, but this is going to need, financial, technological, economic, and operational feasibility analysis in order to basically implement these measures, which will be less costly and could be less costly and offer a higher return.
Luis, thank you for that. I think you've raised many of the issues that I want to get into next. I mean, including human capital, collaboration, know-how, technology, the use of allies, and that, of course, is allies within the private sector, but also allies that we can find within civil society. And it gives me the opportunity to speak a little bit about another initiative that we have going here at the Wilson Center, which looks at how do we build trust in supply chains? Working with some of our partners, such as General Motors, who are trying to green their entire supply chain all the way down. And so, including those Scope 3 emissions from their suppliers. What they're looking at is, do those suppliers have access to reliable, renewable sources of energy? Are they producing in an environmentally sustainable way? But as we're seeing with many of the issues that we discussed in the first part of this conversation, geopolitics, labor, social issues, being able to trust your suppliers is a critical part of the equation. And so what we're looking at in this project called the Waldenberg Initiative on Building Trust in Supply Chains is how we can actually begin to use technology, information flows, AI, blockchain, etc., to gain greater faith or trust in where goods are actually coming from originally. So going back to you, Jessica, I wonder if you could comment on this and perhaps give us some ideas for best practices, guidance for boards as they evaluate their supply chain and how they're going to make that much more consistent with their climate strategy. I mean, from the industry that you're in, I detect, certainly here in the United States and in Canada, a much greater focus now on minimizing carbon footprints from mining, recognizing that mining is an energy intensive business, but finding new technologies, finding renewable sources of energy. And this obviously impacts not just upon the extractive part of mining, but also the processing and refining. So let me turn it over to you, Jessica.
Well, I think you make a lot of good points, and I'd say the same about my other colleagues too on this panel. And I think I would say many of the same things that have come up. Trust is critical. I mean, the reputation of companies with respect to their ESG reporting is critical. It's an opportunity in terms of differentiating yourself. It's also, somewhat of a risk in the event that reporting is inaccurate, thin in terms of what's really behind it, or as you say, you find that you're relying on supplier information that you don't actually control, that ends up presenting a reputational issue for you. None of these issues will be new to my other colleagues either. So I think a key point that has already been raised is the idea of partnerships and becoming very closely engaged with companies that are closely tied to the bulk of emissions within your supply chain. You mentioned, Duncan, mining and energy. You increasingly see these companies, mining companies spinning off energy companies, for example. Mining operations are often very remote and don't have the opportunity to attach to a grid that may be a very clean source of energy. And so the challenge is, how can you find the level of investment that's required for completely independent energy supply when the costs of mining and the influence of commodity cycles, on that can be very significant. But there are a lot of breakthroughs. There's greater automation in the vehicles that are used. There's opportunities for remote electrification. There is, tremendous advances being made. I think we, read in the news this morning or last night, wherever you may be in the world, about Westinghouse and its recent buyers. Which are very much related to mining and remote electrification opportunities. And by that, I mean, Westinghouse Electric and their advancements with very small modular reactors, with nuclear obviously being, zero emission. It's pretty difficult to beat that level and very suitable for remote operations. But again, the partnerships are key, and you don't control supplier information. And so having close relationships in the areas of your supply chain that represent the largest contributions of emissions, I think is the best strategy. The only last point I'll make before allowing others to get in is, and it's been mentioned, Duncan, I think Luis and Anne, you maybe have all mentioned it, is the tremendous workload that's associated with all of this. It's, very challenging to see how small and emerging companies who may be key new suppliers that hold new solutions to all of this, how they can manage the documentation and verification of their products and services. Do think technology is key. I think blockchain, in the example that I raised, and Duncan, you've mentioned it, will be key. But again, that also relies on the input of accurate information. And so I think it is critical, coming back to boards, that there is a key focus on the fundamentals of the Scope 1 and Scope 2 reporting, the company's own ESG policies to ensure that they are, I'll use the overused word, authentic and not just checklist approach, that they actually mean something to the company, uniquely, and are bought into, as opposed to being templates or borrowed. And with these fundamentals in place, I think ultimately workloads, it becomes part of companies' processes. And the Scope 3 has a greater chance of not just being piles of new workload or trying to get assistance from wherever you can to try to build that out, but instead is very solidly grounded in approaches that are truly right for the company and really well understood.
I think you end on a very good note there, Jessica. It's like, and Eve, and Luis hinted at this earlier on, which is that we really have to develop the internal capacity to understand how supply chains operate, and the fact that they're becoming a lot more complex over time. The fact is that we need to dedicate more resources, and that means talent, human capital, technology, and financial resources to making sure that all of these things are consistent. So Anne, let me turn to you. Same question. Advice that you would have for boards as they evaluate the supply chain and climate strategy, and what you see is happening in industry, in the private sector in general, in terms of the resources they're allocating towards this. Because part of it is really to do with sort of their ESG profile, but a lot of it is also to do with compliance. Some of the folks that we work with here in Washington, who work for leading law firms, are, their speciality is really how do you actually comply with government regulations, and now, of course, with reporting requirements that come from non-governmental organizations, insurance firms, financiers, etc. Over to you, Anne.
Yeah. So a couple of things I would add to this, and I think the building trust in the supply chain is so important, because back to your opening about values and value. People want to buy products from companies that they share values with and that they know are responsibly making a product or sourcing a product, or however they are producing that product, whatever it is, the business of the business. So people will, as we've seen, and if it isn't done well, it can hurt the reputation of a company if they're not managing their supply chain responsibly. So I think to the board question, I think the board members need to really lay down really from the beginning, who is responsible at the board level for overseeing this process? Is it a committee as part of the ESG? And then as you break down the various components of ESG, supply chain being a big one for most companies, and especially a retail company. So what are the issues in our ESG activities related to supply chain? And we talked about those, going back to, where it's being produced, how it's being produced, the labor issues, the material issues, the production, the transportation issues. And so who at the board level owns that?
Sure.
How are you establishing a baseline of what information you need to make sure it's being properly overseen? And then monitoring, reporting on that information to your stakeholders, being transparent with your investors, your stakeholders, your employees, your communities, anyone who's involved. I use stakeholders writ large in that regard to communicate with them what you are doing. Many companies are sort of on the beginning stage of this journey. They may not be as far along as others, but you have got to start, the journey of 1,000 miles begins with one step. Start somewhere in terms of the board needs to oversee this. How are we going to report on it? Who is responsible at the board level? And then who is responsible within management? And that gets to your issue of resources and human capital. Are you going to have, for certain companies, you have head of supply chain, you have the compliance people who then are the ones who measure and manage and making sure you are complying with the local statutes, the reporting requirements in terms of that. But all of it I see is very much integral to your strategy, your business strategy of making sure you're running a successful company. And so it isn't an add-on, it is actually integrated into the operation of the company, and you're just cutting it and looking at it from a different perspective. But I see all these ESG issues, and especially on supply chain for us, it's integral to our business because we have to make the products that we sell in our stores. So how are we overseeing that? So from the board level, you've got to raise up to the oversight function of the board and hold management accountable, but also educate yourself on the issues that are emerging. And as someone said, they're going to be changing. The strategy of this is going to be changing constantly, depending on the regulations, but keep the board educated, what committee is responsible, and continue to stay on top of it and ask for regular reports from management as to what's happening and what's going on within this sector.
And I'd like to push you a little bit on that final answer, because I mean, there was so much in there. And, having the board demand this information and to demand progress in these issues is where many companies are today. But how difficult has it been, in your opinion, to get there? Because it wasn't so long ago that some of these were seen as being marginal issues. Now they're core issues. And that's a remarkable transformation. I wonder if you could comment on on the process of getting them to that core position, and also, the obstacles that need to be overcome.
Yeah, I guess the way that I would approach that is the board works in partnership with management to make sure you have the right oversight plan to manage these activities. So it isn't a us versus them. We are there to provide, in that regard, our value add for how the company, and we're the representatives of shareholders, how the companies are going to manage this. So if you're early in the journey and you don't have a process in place, do we need to bring in someone, a consultant, an outsider to help us put this together? Or do our internal people have a handle on this, and for the board to query them in terms of how this is being handled and what the reports are? So it hasn't, for a company like ours, and Victoria said it was L Brands before that, the supply chain was something we paid close attention to for many years. Not just the source, what countries we're producing in, how we're transporting. So it was a matter of making sure that the board was informed of all the processes and the steps that were being taken. And then also, more importantly, being transparent with our investors, stakeholders about what is going on in this regard. So because you didn't, as we saw with Nike way back when you ran into a problem with supply chain and production, it caused serious reputational damage to that company. And so no retailer wanted to get into that type of situation. So you have these responsible sourcing standards, you have the independent third parties verifying who are producing for you and what is being done. So it is for the board educating themselves on what those processes are and making sure that we are reporting them, and then pushing and making sure that we're staying ahead of them. So I see it as a partnership, but also a oversight role for the board to make sure these things are not falling through the cracks.
Thank you, Anne. Yeah, Jessica, come back in, please.
Thanks. Maybe not my turn, but just to jump in with another thought on those great comments. I think it's important for board members to recognize that this whole area is, in my experience, and I'm sure all of ours, a tremendous point of pride inside companies, certainly the companies, the boards that I sit on. Tremendous sense of purpose and I'll just say pride around this area. And I think the board has an important opportunity to really support the work that's being done and to, again, recognize the workload that's associated with it. And so for the board to be disciplined and not overly curious about all kinds of fascinating things in this area, but really support and recognize the work inside the company. I do think it's a really important driver of talent recruitment and retention. If that culture can really be recognized, and the board has an important role in that. And this work, to your question, Duncan, of like how do you ensure all of this gets done, is just to fertilize the seed. And in my experience, it really is an area that that management and everyone below them is extremely enthusiastic about bringing forward.
I love that you got onto the sense of pride and the impact upon recruitment and retainment. Those are key issues, I think, in this. And, I'll be honest, I'm 54 years old. When I was looking for work, it wasn't even a question in my head about what is the sort of the climate impact of the companies that I would work for. But for folks who are out in the job market today, particularly those who are, the younger folks coming in, that's a key question for them. And speaking to younger employees of major corporations who have made the transition now to greener supply chains, they love to talk about it. And they love to tell me that, in fact, they feel much better about working for that company than they did in the past. Luis, I want to turn to you. Same question. This is a question, this is really about advice for boardrooms as they evaluate their supply chain. What are you seeing in terms of best practices? And I want to move on to the next question for you, Luis, as well, which is really, we've been talking about established firms so far. What about the firms who are just getting started on this? What about the boards who actually haven't really begun to, or only just beginning to rethink their supply chains and their relationship to climate?
Thank you, Duncan. Let me just quickly go back to the first question about how to build trust in the supply chain. And I would just everything has been said basically by Jessica, and I would just add that, the key point in my view is to really get involved and provide training, share best practices, have a good communication, and basically, try to help and get involved with the supply chain, and so that they can see you as somebody who can help me and not somebody who is asking me to meet certain requirements. But it's somebody who's asking me to meet the requirements, yes, but who is telling me how to do it and advising me on what's the easiest way to do it. What my only point the only point I can add, I think, is that we should be realistic. Technology could be an issue, so obviously we should be realistic. There are some regions, not all the regions in the world are equally advanced technologically. So obviously, not all the regions have the same ecosystems or fuels or types of transport, etc., etc. No? So I think we should just be realistic in see what we demand from them, but basically always be behind them, providing support, providing training, and sharing best practices. And going into the second question, for basically boardrooms that are starting this journey and basically to rethink the supply chains relationship. Climate change mitigation will only work if the top of the company is informed and fully committed. Okay, I've seen a lot of examples where you see the board still doubting, the board still questioning, what is this all about? Is this like a mode? This is something that will go away soon, or do we really have to commit? And I think that's key. If the top is not committed, then management is not going to commit, and the rest of the company is not going to commit, and obviously supply chain is not going to commit. I would say basically my advice to these boardrooms that are getting into this matter is basically, get informed, read about the topic, share knowledge, discuss it amongst board members, all these implications we mentioned about geopolitical and economic circumstances that can affect the business, etc., so you can see the real value of getting involved. All the assess, measure, and try to mitigate the risks involved. Then discuss these issues with the executive team, and basically conclude and analyze the different alternatives you have based on your experience and their experience. There are a lot of trainings offered by the company, offered by different experts. Well, participate, learn about it. I think as board member, we should learn as much as we can about these all ESG matters, basically. Very important, support initiatives and budgets related to ESG matters, because there's no use in you learning about it and suddenly you don't approve the budget necessary or whatever initiative is presented to you. So basically support it and basically keep close to your suppliers, provide all the training and best practices, as I already mentioned, leverage on new information technologies so you can detect, logistical patterns, and basically you can focus on critical points, on areas of opportunity, etc., so that you can probably develop with the supply chain, develop different, transport logistics, something like that. So try to get my point is get involved, really put yourself in their place, and try to really get involved in developing new alternatives so that they can see you as a real partner and not somebody who's just asking for something that you don't understand and you don't want to do. That would be my
Let me add one thing. I think it's also important for companies. So many companies are now rated or ranked on some of their efforts in this regard. You need to be aware of how people are viewing you and how you are being rated and what goes into that. I wouldn't have that drive your action, but be aware of those outside, because it can affect investors in terms of the capital that may flow to the company. It may reflect very well, to Jessica's point, in terms of companies having a sense of pride, where the employees are very proud that they work for a company that has a high rating in this regard and that they have high standards. So I think it's important to understand how you are perceived to the outside world on your efforts in this regard, and be transparent about those efforts.
It's amazing how many times the word transparency has come up in this conversation. I'm delighted being a member of the board of Transparency International myself, and having worked with the World Economic Forum on these issues for many years. And generally we think about transparency in the context of the fight against corruption, but this is an area where in fact transparency is being demanded by investors, by insurance companies, by the broader stakeholder community. And I think that there are a number of resources there which we haven't really tapped into yet adequately, with civil society organizations that could provide great insights for private companies. I think all too often we see that there is a kind of a standoff where you have the civil society companies on one side saying, we want more transparency, and companies saying, we don't want to engage with those guys because they're activists. And I think that what we need to see is sort of more of a coming together on those issues. There's one last issue that I want to bring up before we open this up for questions. I do urge our audience to think of a question that they'd like to ask. But in terms of where, and this wasn't something that you were prepared for, so forgive the blind side here, but where do you see this going in the immediate future? And we've come an enormously long way in recent times. Obviously, there are still dynamics underway. The war in Ukraine, the recent announcement of the Inflation Reduction Act here in the United States, which is going to provide a huge boost to renewable energies. Of course, we've got the meeting of the COP later on this year as well. What can we predict for the next 3 to 5 years? I know it's a really difficult question. Everybody hates pulling out the crystal ball, but why don't we begin with you, Luis, because you're still unmuted, so I'm afraid it falls to you.
I should have muted myself. No, I think it's a very good question, Duncan. I'm going to talk about the case of Mexico. Hey, this is the one I know, which I think the situation is different than Anne's and Jessica's. Mexico is behind probably some parts of the world. I normally use Europe as the main point of reference, and Mexico is behind Europe. So in some way, what I can tell you is, what do I expect for Mexico in the next 3 years? What I've seen in Europe for the last 3 years. Okay, I mean, the development, the growth we have had in all these matters have basically followed the same pattern followed in Europe, basically, and North America and Japan, Asia and some other parts of the world. That's what I would expect. You can see, for example, green financing. If you look at a graph of green financing, you see it's an exponential graph. And it's an exponential graph. And if you look at it, at least in the case of Mexico, for example, last year, 2021, we had about 51% of the total amount issued of bonds issued, of green bonds issued, happened last year. So it's a completely exponential graph. And this is, I'm using that just as an example of all these, the incorporation of the supply chain into all ESG matters. As I mentioned, unfortunately, we do not have a regulation requirement in Mexico. The push has come from basically investors. And we have a lot of foreign investment, and these investors are the ones that are pushing. And now domestic investors are also pushing in favor of ESG compliance, let's call it, or mitigation of climate change, et cetera, et cetera. So, my answering specifically your question, Duncan, what I see is growth. I see a lot more penetration. Today in the Mexican market, the big companies are the ones that are really into it. The medium companies, medium-sized banks are still behind, but they are asking questions. So I have no doubt they will be fully incorporated in the near future. So I hope I'm right, and we have a much more ESG compliant economy in general in the next, 3 years.
Thank you, Luis. Anne.
Yeah, what I would say is, sort of from the US perspective, that this issue is not going away. In fact, it's even regardless of what the SEC finally ends up doing on reporting of climate change, scope 1, 2, 3, and where that regulation comes out, to Luis's point, investors are going to be asking for this information. Your employees are going to be asking for this information, your stakeholders, your communities. So it's going to be more of the same. It may come in the form of regulation, or it may just come in the form of private ordering and the marketplace demanding the transparency on this. So I think it will continue on. There's been a pushback, as I think we all know, at least in the US, on some of these ESG issues by certain politicians. But I think to the extent that businesses, and this is what we talked about before, supply chain and a successful, well-run supply chain is core to the success of a business. And so this is not a political issue in the sense of small p, but rather a business strategy issue. So I think it's going to be more of the same. And there again, the companies are being transparent about how this is part of their fundamental business operations, and having a good, successful supply chain that minimizes its impact on the environment is going to be demanded in the future.
Thanks, Anne. Jessica.
Yeah, I would say much the same, and I would put a spin on Anne's opening comment that this is not going away, and my spin would be, we have no time to waste, and that's not going to change. Again, if I just go back to, I don't mean to be overly mining oriented because I don't spend all my time in that sector, but we need the minerals and metals that are required for a sustainable economy, and we need a security of supply and responsible production, and you can't turn the clock back. And frankly, we are speaking from my Canadian perspective, there's so much work happening in order to try to be a strong participant in the, as we already are, in the supply. So I really think in the 3 to 5 year time frame, here's what I would say. This is hard work. It's very hard work. For all levels of companies, for everyone who's out there supporting with analysis, recommendations, and solutions forward. We will, I believe, in the 3 to 5 years ahead, we'll feel more like we're out of the starting blocks. When there is some acceptance of which reporting standard are we using, how do you ultimately transition from your emissions reduction targets to, let's say, absolute intensity, or whatever is right for a company and appropriate for the sector. When the requirements are ultimately settled and frameworks are in place, and technology can then support the frameworks, and there's a greater ability, I'd like to say, to breathe. Maybe that's overly hopeful in the next 3 to 5 years. But I think over that time period, I'd like to think that it feels like this has been very hard work. It was worth it. Greater clarity has come to all of it, and we're all in the playing field together. And what I hope for, you didn't ask that question, but I'll throw it out there, in that same time period, is that sort of all stakeholders. So I think I'm talking about consumers and analysts and investors and everybody, that we are all able to look through a similar lens, because I think companies and maybe sectors can suffer perception issues that are not necessarily accurate. And I think if we're all agreeing to look through a lens that has settled out, and we look at the real performance of companies in terms that relate comparatively, then we can talk about, okay, where to from here? And we can talk about, us as being a collective community who's done this work and is moving forward. I don't think it helps when there's, a bias or biases out there that are perhaps just based off, I don't know, past media reporting or something someone picked up, or political divides or whatever. So I'd like to think that it all feels like it's been hard work. It will continue to be work, but we're settled into a framework with more consistency. We agree to look through the common lens of that consistency, and then 3 to 5 years from now, we're talking about where to from here.
You have brought us to the very end of our time here today, and I want to thank all of our panelists for their participation. We have covered a wide range of issues. I found it incredibly informative, the advice that has been given here today, not just on how to continue doing what we're doing, but how to get started on it. And keywords that I'm going to take away: collaboration, human resources and talent, and the fact that ultimately we need to be out ahead of this, because one of the things that I've learned, both in terms of the energy transition, ESG, but also in terms of questions of transparency, is we can't just think about the standards which are being applied today. We've got to think about the standards that are coming down the pipe 5 years from now. And the goalposts are constantly moving. Things are becoming much more demanding. Having a strategy from the board which actually builds that flexibility in so that we can continue to move forward, I think is vital. Thank you so much to all 3 of our panelists, Anne, Luis, Jessica. Terrific performance today. Thanks to our audience for listening, and hopefully we'll see you again soon.
Thank you.